She was slapped in front of a full cabin and told she didn't belong. Madison, the lead flight attendant, saw Elise Carter and assumed she was just another black woman in the wrong seat. But Elise wasn't lost. She wasn't mistaken. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Madison mocked her, humiliated her, and tried to raise her presence with power she thought no one would question. But when they picked Elise, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was the CEO of the airline, the woman who owned the very jet they were flying in. And what came next wasn't just a moment of reckoning. It was the beginning of a policy shift, a message that echoed far beyond the aisle of that plane. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. Outside, the tarmac shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. Inside, tension hung thick in the air. Leather seats gleamed, champagne flutes clinked quietly, and at the center of it all sat a woman, soaked in spilled water, silenced by no one, and seconds away from changing everything. Her name was Elise Carter, mid-40s, elegant in the quiet way that confidence wears. She stepped onto the plane without fanfare, her navy blue blazer pressed to perfection, her suitcase worn but dignified, like her. The cabin gleamed with the kind of sterile luxury reserved for executives and old money. Plush cream leather seats, chilled champagne already poured, and flight attendants smiling like they were guarding a palace. But when Elise handed over her boarding pass to the lead attendant, something shifted. The woman, Madison, with her tight bun and tighter smile, barely glanced at the ticket before flicking her eyes up in that familiar, slicing way. Slow, assessing, dismissive. "Ma'am," she said, her tone too crisp to be warm, "I think you're mistaken. This is first class." Elise simply nodded. "I know." That should have been the end of it, but the silence between them thickened. Madison leaned in, lowering her voice, as if Elise were an inconvenience, not a guest. "I'm sure economy will be more comfortable for you." A hush rippled around them as passengers glanced up, sensing something brewing. Elise's eyes stayed steady. "I think you should check your list again." Her voice was calm, too calm, and maybe that's what irritated Madison most, the refusal to bend. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She just stood there, unshaken. That's when it happens, the moment that marks the beginning of a slow unraveling. Madison doesn't even glance at the manifest. She waves Elise off with a dismissive, "Security can handle it." And just like that, Elise isn't just a woman finding her seat. She's a woman being told in front of strangers that she doesn't belong. Have you ever felt out of place in a space you rightfully earned? That ache isn't loud, it's quiet, humiliating, sharp. As Elise walked down the aisle under the weight of 50 stares, she didn't curse. She didn't cry. She simply sat. And in that stillness, there was something unsettling. Because dignity, when disrespected, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just waits. And what it waits for can change everything. Elise hadn't asked for a scene, but the moment she sat down, seat 2A, clearly marked on her boarding pass, the atmosphere shifted like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Madison, still fuming from their earlier exchange, walked past her again and again without a glance, offering water to everyone except Elise, her tray of sparkling glasses always running out just as she approached. Elise watched it all with the quiet patience of someone who had seen this kind of treatment before, but hoped, perhaps foolishly, that things had changed. The final insult came not with words, but with a calculated act. Elise shifted her legs slightly into the aisle, stretching after a long day, when Madison, returning with another tray, didn't ask her to move. She didn't pause or warn. She simply marched straight through and slammed her shin into Elise's. The tray tilted, ice-cold water splashed across Elise's lap. A gasp erupted from a nearby passenger. Madison recoiled theatrically, then barked loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Watch where you put your legs. You've made a mess. Elise blinked slowly, brushing water from her pants, her voice still soft. You walked into me. Her words weren't angry, just true. Madison froze, caught off guard by the calm. I've only asked to be treated like everyone else, Elise continued. If that's too much, then maybe the problem isn't me. The moment hung in the air like a suspended verdict. A woman 2 rows up muttered, She's just looking for trouble. Another passenger whispered, She doesn't look like the usual crowd. And suddenly, the real tension emerged. Not just between Elise and Madison, but in the gaze of strangers deciding who deserved to be there. Have you ever watched a room quietly turn against someone, just because they refused to be small? Elise sat motionless, dripping but composed. Her silence didn't signal defeat. It signaled something deeper. Because sometimes the cruelest humiliation isn't shouted. It's served cold, with a smile, and justified as policy. But Elise knew better. This wasn't about rules. It was about the line people draw between us and them, and how far they'll go to make sure that line stays uncrossed. Madison's control was slipping, and Elise could feel it, tension rising like cabin pressure before turbulence. The hum of the engines faded beneath the unspoken drama unraveling in slow motion. Elise had said nothing threatening, made no demands, yet her poise unnerved Madison more than any outburst could have. That's when it happened. In a moment so sudden it stunned the breath from the room, Madison raised her hand and slapped Elise across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin like a thunderclap. Sharp, deliberate, shocking. Gasps erupted, glasses clinked. A businessman halfway to his feet froze in disbelief. A woman clutched her pearls. The silence that followed was deafening. Elise didn't flinch. Her face, stinging and flushed, stayed forward. She didn't touch the mark. She didn't look away. She simply raised her chin, her gaze settling on Madison with the quiet power of someone who had endured much worse in far more dangerous rooms. You just made the worst mistake of your life, she said, her voice low but precise, each word cutting through the tension like a blade. Madison's breath hitched, just for a second, but arrogance, like a reflex, tried to rescue her. Oh, please, she snapped. You've been causing a scene since you boarded. Elise didn't respond. Her silence said more than shouting ever could. And yet, can silence really protect you from a world that sees your dignity as optional? A world that watches, hesitates, and too often does nothing? Around them, the cabin seemed frozen in time. The younger flight attendant, wide-eyed, hands trembling, glanced toward the manifest, toward Elise's boarding pass, toward anything that might make this right. But fear kept her rooted. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or stay quiet. Elise remained still. But within her stillness, something was already in motion. She reached for her phone, not with panic, but precision, and typed a message quickly, quietly. Then she set it down beside her, her fingers calm on the armrest. Tears. She didn't need to raise her voice. Because justice, when it's already on its way, doesn't knock. It walks in when the world least expects it. The moment the cockpit door opened, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The pilot, an older man with a furrowed brow and urgency in his stride, walked down the aisle with purpose, his gaze scanning the rows until it landed on Elise. Then, without hesitation, he turned to Madison. You need to step aside, he said firmly. Madison blinked. Excuse me? Her voice wavered between indignation and confusion. I'm handling this. The pilot didn't flinch. Not anymore. I've received confirmation. Miss Elise Carter is not just a passenger. She's the owner of this aircraft. The words dropped like lead in the cabin. A wave of gasps, murmurs, and wide-eyed stares rippled from seat to seat. Madison stepped back as if struck. What? She whispered, her cheeks draining of color. Elise didn't move. She didn't need to. She sat as she had from the beginning, composed, quiet, watching everything unfold exactly as it was meant to. The younger flight attendant, Grace, covered her mouth, eyes flicking toward Elise in stunned recognition. "She owns the plane?" someone near the front muttered. "She owns the airline," another corrected, voice hushed with awe. And then came the shift, the palpable turning of the tide. Those who had sneered looked away. Those who had whispered leaned forward, suddenly interested in being on the right side of this story. But Elise wasn't interested in spectators. She stood slowly, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer with the same grace she'd carried since the moment she boarded. "I'm Elise Carter," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Owner of this plane." "And the company you fly for?" Madison's mouth opened, but no words came. The woman who once commanded the aisle now stood diminished, her bravado collapsing beneath the weight of the truth. Have you ever watched someone realize too late that they'd misjudged everything? The silence around them wasn't just shock, it was shame. Because the truth didn't arrive with a shout. It walked in wearing calm, power, and patience. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. Elise didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her presence did it for her. She turned to the pilot, her expression composed but resolute. "I want this addressed immediately," she said, "and I want it on record. What happened here should never happen to anyone, ever again." The pilot nodded, his face grim with understanding. Madison, still standing stiffly by the galley, tried to recover. "Miss Carter, I didn't know." Her voice was barely audible, brittle as glass. Elise turned to her, eyes steady. "You didn't know because you didn't care to. You judged, you humiliated, and then you assaulted. Not because of policy, but because of prejudice." Madison opened her mouth to protest, but Elise raised a hand, not to silence her, but to cut through the performance. "There is no misunderstanding. You crossed a line, and there are consequences." Before Madison could flee, 2 uniformed officers boarded the plane. The air seemed to shift again as they approached, their presence final and immovable. One turned to Elise, addressing her with clear respect. "Miss Carter, we received your report. Do you wish to press charges?" Elise didn't hesitate. "Yes, I was assaulted in front of dozens of witnesses. I expect accountability." The cabin, once teetering on the edge of indifference, now buzzed with quiet approval. Passengers who had remained silent were watching closely now, some recording discreetly, others nodding with somber respect. Madison stammered, stepping back as the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. "Please, I didn't mean—" Elise's face remained unreadable. "You didn't mean to get caught," she replied coldly. "But you did. And now you'll face the consequences." Have you ever seen someone fall, not from status, but from the illusion of superiority they wore like armor? It doesn't happen with fire or fury. It happens with truth. Madison was escorted off the plane, her tears trailing behind her like the last remnants of control. And Elise, calm, elegant, and now undeniably seen, stood not as a victim, but as the enforcer of a lesson that had been long overdue. The cabin was silent as Elise turned back to face the passengers, many of whom still looked stunned, others ashamed. She didn't speak right away. She let the moment settle, allowed everyone to sit with what they had just witnessed. Then, in a voice as composed as ever, she said, "To everyone here, I apologize that you had to witness what happened today. This is not the standard I hold for my airline. From this day forward, I promise, every passenger will be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like or what someone assumes about them." A wave of applause broke out, soft at first, then building as heads nodded, as a sense of justice rippled through the cabin like fresh air after a storm. Even the most skeptical among them could no longer deny what they had seen. Elise turned to Grace, the younger attendant whose eyes still brimmed with emotion. "You did the right thing today. You showed integrity when it wasn't easy. Expect a call from my office." Grace's jaw dropped slightly, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. "Thank you, Miss Carter," she whispered, but Elise just smiled. "Thank you, Grace." The warmth of the moment spread, melting the tension that had stiffened the air for hours. Even the nosy woman who had once whispered doubts now leaned forward with admiration, murmuring, "You're incredible." Elise nodded graciously. "Remember this. It's always worth standing up for what's right. Have you ever wished you'd spoken up sooner, before the damage was done?" That's the quiet ache many carry. But today, Elise had turned that silence into a statement. Days later, her story had gone viral. Interviews, news headlines, social media buzzing with praise, not just for what she did, but how she did it. In a televised interview, when asked what message she wanted to send, she answered without pause, "Respect is a right, not a luxury, and true leadership means protecting that right for everyone." The world listened, policies changed, conversations started, and somewhere, on another plane, in another terminal, a passenger was greeted not with suspicion, but with the smile they always deserved. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't loud, it's steady. Elise Carter didn't raise her voice or demand the spotlight. She didn't strike back with anger. Instead, she stood firm in who she was, letting truth speak through her dignity, and that quiet strength changed everything. This story reminds us that respect should never be given based on appearances. It should be a given. Too often, people are judged before they're known, dismissed before they're heard. But as we age, we come to see that what lasts isn't status or titles, it's how we treat each other when no one's watching. In a world that moves fast and forgets quickly, Elise's story lingers because it touches something timeless: the need to be seen, to be valued, and to be treated as human. No matter our age, we've all had moments where we felt overlooked or watched someone else be pushed aside. And maybe the lesson is this: you don't have to shout to be strong, you just have to stay rooted in what's right. Because when dignity meets courage, even the smallest gesture can leave a lasting mark. Elise didn't leave that flight with applause. She left with quiet, unshakable grace. No press conference, no dramatic farewell, just the sound of her footsteps down the jetway, her head held high, and the calm of knowing she had stood her ground without ever raising her voice. That kind of strength doesn't shout, it resonates. And in its stillness, it heals. In the days that followed, her story didn't just spark outrage, it sparked reflection. Policies were reviewed, voices that had once been silenced began to rise. And somewhere, someone watching remembered their own moment of being overlooked and began to believe that dignity could still win. Because the work isn't done after the confrontation. It continues in the rebuilding, in the quiet reforms, in the daily choices to treat others with the respect they deserve. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.